Avoir. Okay, hello, and welcome to another episode of FitPet Boston Talks. My name is Leah Lodato, and I'm the host of the show. And today, we are continuing the discussion about nutrition in dogs, and I want to talk specifically about carbohydrate metabolism. CABs, as they say. The reason why I wanted to bring up this topic is because I kind of look out to the landscape of social media posts, social media influencers, and I see a lot of conflicting information when it comes to carbohydrates, the usefulness of carbohydrates, the necessity of carbohydrates, the vilifying of carbohydrates. And I just wanted to do a little bit of research on my own to figure out what is the deal, what is acceptable, and what should we be feeding our dogs. So as usual, I'm going to make the disclaimer that I am not a pet nutritionist. I'm not someone that is educated in this field. I am an enthusiastic owner. I'm a trainer. Most of the time you can find me hiking in the woods with dogs, having a grand old time with dogs off the leash. So I'm not an expert in the field, but I do think that it's worthwhile to have these discussions because my clients oftentimes ask questions concerning what they're feeding their dog. They have questions about dog food. They have concerns because they see recalls. They have concerns because they see social media posts that are peddling a certain brand of food or a certain way of feeding their dog. And it is up to me to have some sort of an answer. And if I don't have an answer, my goal is always to help people think critically about the decisions that they're making. So even somebody that's going to be an expert in a field, I believe it's their responsibility to help people think critically, not necessarily to give them a specific answer. Because when it comes straight down to it, all of our dogs are different. They have different genetics. They have different propensities. They have different ways of expressing themselves. They're individuals. And some dogs are going to do really great on a specific type of dog food, and while others are not. That's just the fact of the matter and the way that it goes. My goal here is to just tickle your brain and get you thinking about this topic. And if you want to, do your own research or go ahead and read the references that I'm going to lightly touch on here in this podcast episode. Okay, so what are carbohydrates? Carbohydrates are one of the three macronutrients that are found in food. So we have carbohydrates, fat, and protein. That's where the bulk of the calories from the food come from, both for dogs and for humans. So the question that I want to answer right off the bat are carbohydrates necessary for my dog? And I think the answer, after doing a little bit of reading, is no. I don't think that carbohydrates are necessary for a dog. So if I read right out of the textbook that I've been slowly making my way through here, chapter 10 out of the textbook titled Canine and Feline Nutrition is titled Carbohydrate Metabolism. The dog is capable of meeting its metabolic requirements for glucose from glucogenetic pathways throughout growth and adult maintenance, provided that sufficient fat and protein are included in the diet. However, the need for an exogenous source of carbohydrate during the metabolically stressful periods of gestation and lactation has been debated. So this book is about 500 pages long, and there's a whopping 4 pages on carbohydrate metabolism. Just like what I just read said, it outlines the need for carbohydrates for lactating females. There have been some conflicting studies about that topic, but it seems as though because the energy requirement for a female dog giving birth is so large, adding carbohydrate to the diet can help with the whole shebang-a-lang. So later on, it goes to talk about the utilization of dietary carbohydrates. So how do your dogs actually use dietary carbohydrates? Because they are found in pet foods. The fact that dogs and cats don't require carbohydrate in the diet is usually immaterial because most commercial foods include at least a moderate level of this nutrient. It goes on to say dietary starch provides an economical and digestible energy source, and it is also essential for the extrusion process used in the preparation of most dry pet food. The digestibility and utilization of dietary starch by dogs and cats is affected by several factors, including the type of starch, the degree of heat treatment, and the size of the starch granules. Heating greatly increases digestibility, and finely ground starch is more digestible than coarsely ground granules. And the other thing I wanted to note out of this text is fiber is the other carbohydrate component commonly present in pet food. Although dietary fiber is not a required nutrient per se, the inclusion of optimal amounts of fiber in the diets of companion animals is necessary for normal functioning and health of the gastrointestinal tract. So we have fiber, we have carbohydrates, starches, and also we have fiber, which the text is saying not necessary, but, including fiber in optimal amounts are going to keep your pet's gut functioning normally. Okay, so to me, that means that fiber is a pretty important piece of the puzzle. So that was the first reference that I wanted to highlight there. So the text is basically saying, does your dog need carbohydrates? No, they can get the glycogen that they need via protein, provided they are getting enough protein in their diet. Fiber is really important. And if your dog is eating a commercial pet food, that food probably has a good amount of carbohydrate in the food, but the carbohydrates are more digestible because of the way that the food is prepared. So to me, that is setting the stage for the next article that I'm going to reference. So the next article is by a nutritionist named Alex Rankovic. She published a paper called The Role of Carbohydrates in the Health of Dogs. And full disclosure, this paper is meant to argue that, well, I'll tell you what it's meant to argue. I'm going to just go ahead and read the clinical summary at the end of the paper. Now, this is an 8-page paper. It's very accessible. It's all over the internet. You can read it if you want. I'll put it in the show notes. In an 8-page paper, she has 144 references at the end of this paper. So it's a well-researched piece. And it is frequently referenced, especially by pet nutritionists. Once again, because, just like the textbook mentioned, dry dog food contains large amounts of carbohydrates. So I think from a nutritionist point of view, they have to defend why it's okay for this amount of carbohydrate to be in dog food. If you agree with this defense, and you're like, yeah, I agree. Like, my dog is healthy on the food that I'm feeding. It has a high level of carbohydrate and I'm okay with that. Go for it. If you are against this defense and you say, this is unnatural, my dog doesn't do well on dry dog kibble, I need more protein in their food in order to keep them healthy, that's my anecdotal experience, that's fine too. I'm just giving you guys some information here to chew on and to discuss and to just use in order to make decisions for yourself. Okay, so the summary at the end of Rankovic's paper. Despite the large number of dog owners who are averse to feeding carbohydrates to their pets, there is little evidence to support the contention that any negative health effects result from feeding diets that provide dietary carbohydrates in amounts of 30 to 60%, commonly found in commercial extruded pet foods. There appears to be no association between dietary carbohydrate and the development of obesity, diabetes mellitus, which is type 1 diabetes, cancer, or adverse food reactions in dogs. In fact, dogs appear to have evolved so that they can metabolize substantial quantities of carbohydrate. Increasing the amount of complex carbohydrates in diets results in the reduction of dietary protein or fat, or both, which may provide benefits for dogs with certain conditions such as obesity, diabetes, with concurrent pancreatitis, or adverse food reactions. Okay, and I'm going to unpack a couple of those arguments briefly. The first one that I wanted to talk about is obesity. So she talks about obesity being the number one most common nutritional disorder affecting dogs, period. That is a statistic. 17 to 44% of dogs in developed countries are overweight. Wowza, that number is just staggering, right? So that obesity is going to cause, and this is my opinion now, is going to cause more health problems than feeding your dog an excess amount of carbohydrate. Why? Because obesity, it just causes strain on all of the dog's systems, their joints, their organs, their brain, their heart, everything. It's just not good for your dog to be overweight. How do dogs get overweight? They get overweight by eating too much. Too much of everything. Too much carbs, protein, and fat. Rankovic makes the argument here that it is difficult to overfeed your dog carbohydrate, and most of the time dogs become overweight by eating too much fat, which, if we think about this practically, like, kind of makes sense. So let's say you're feeding your dog a lot of table scraps. You're feeding them a lot of like meat or bones, or you're feeding them like pizza crust. Like, pizza crust has a shitload of fat, you guys. Like, people think that, oh, it's like bread. No, that's dripping with oil. There's probably cheese on it. And, that oftentimes when our dietary fat goes up, I think both for us and for dogs, it happens in conjunction with a carbohydrate. So if you took carbohydrate alone, and this is a sidebar, if you took carbohydrate alone, like let's say a bowl of rice, and you tried to house that, you're going to have a hard time. It's like sticky, viscous. It doesn't taste good, even if you put a bunch of salt on it. However, if you take that rice and you fry it up in some olive oil and salt, that'll go down faster than you could even ever imagine, right? So fat increases the palatability of carbohydrates to the point where we could eat an entire cheesecake, right? And the only reason why is because of all of that fat and sweet and all of that mixed together. And I think the same is true for fat. Like, nobody's taking a stick of butter and just housing it, right? We're putting that butter on top of pasta. We're putting the cheese on top of a pizza, right? So when we feed our dogs table scraps, we're increasing mostly the fat and carbohydrate intake of our dog. Most of the time we're not feeding them raw eggs as a table scrap, which is a great source of nutrition, fat and protein, right? Most of the time we're not feeding them a really lean cut of meat, which is also a great source of protein. So overweight dogs are unhealthy dogs, and we have to get a handle on that. Overfeeding is what causes obesity, not because you're feeding your dog Alpo dog food. If you're feeding your dog Alpo dog food and they're overweight, maybe they don't do well on that food, but maybe you're overfeeding them. Maybe you're feeding them too many table scraps. Maybe the dog is hanging out by the kid's high chair after the kid goes to bed, cleaning up the mess. And if they do that 2 times a day, every single day, they're getting a lot more calories than they should. So keeping our dog's weight in check, more important than even this carbohydrate discussion. But let's continue. So carbohydrate content in evolutionary diets. So it's oftentimes a common theme that people think dogs are carnivores because wolves are classified as carnivores, and wolves are the most close ancestor to dogs. So dogs evolved from the gray wolf. So if we take a look at the way dogs evolved, they evolved to digest carbohydrates as they were moving through life with us. Human beings went from being hunter-gatherers to more agriculturalists. And if we look at fossilized scat from dogs, we see that quite a bit of their diet was actually carbohydrate. And there are a few references here outside of Rankovic's paper. One of them is titled Dietary and Nutrient Profiles of Wild Wolves, Insight for Optimal Dog Nutrition, published in 2014. There's a great Psychology Today article, again with references, titled Did Eating Human Poop Play a Role in the Evolution of Dogs? It's a really long article, actually. It has a lot of juicy details about a dog's diet as they were evolving alongside of humans. And it's very clear from the study, Dietary Nutrient Profiles of Wild Wolves, Insight for Optimal Dog Nutrition, that the dog's actual genes changed in order to be able to digest starch. So I'll read from the text. Although most modern day dogs no longer look like wolves, they can still inbreed and produce fertile offspring, making dogs a subspecies of wolves. Considering the relatively short time span in which domestication occurred at the close genetic relationship, the dog's genome would still predominantly be the product of environmental selective pressures imposed upon its ancestor, the wolf. So basically it's saying it wouldn't have evolved like this on its own. Recent evidence shows that 3 genes involved in starch digestion and glucose uptake were the target of selection during domestication. The AMY2B copy number expansion is, however, not fixed across all dog breeds. The Saluki, an ancient breed originating from the Fertile Crescent, showed 29 copies. Ancient breeds such as the Dingo and Siberian Husky show no or limited the expansion, which suggests that these breeds arose alongside hunter-gatherers rather than agriculturists. And the list goes on. Okay, so cool. Ancient breeds might have a bit less of an ability to digest carbohydrates because of the way that they evolved alongside humans. So take note of that if you got a husky mix. Do a little bit of research. Okay, so let's go back to the paper here. So the paper is basically echoing what the study says. The paper actually references that study. Continuing, pet dogs are descended from wolves. Investigators of one study determined that the adaptation to a starch-rich diet was a crucial step in the early domestication of modern dogs. The authors of that study performed whole genomic sequencing of dogs and wolves and identified 36 unique genomic regions that contained 122 genes belonging to dogs. Specifically, 10 genes were identified as having key roles in starch digestion and fat metabolism. Additionally, dogs had greater expression of the pancreatic amylase gene and higher activity of that enzyme compared with results from wolves. Therefore, this evidence indicated that dogs have evolved to digest dietary starch much more efficiently than do gray wolves. It goes on to say, however, the proportion of plant matter consumed by wolves can range from 0 to 50% of the overall diet, which would suggest that wolves can also metabolize substantial amounts of dietary starch and fiber. Okay, so we established that do dogs need carbohydrate in their diet? No, because they can get the glucose, glycogen that they need for their muscles from protein metabolism, which happens in their liver, if they are getting enough protein. But they have evolved to be able to digest carbohydrate, so the presence of carbohydrate in the food is digestible. It's not like the dog is either allergic to it, or it's not like the dog just poops it out. Okay, so if our dogs can utilize carbohydrate as an energy source, why not use it? I think is the argument that people make. Carbohydrates are a very accessible, inexpensive source of energy for both humans and dogs. If we've kind of flipped the argument over, we can say humans don't need carbohydrates in order to survive. We can get all of the energy that we need from fat and protein calories. People who choose to eat this way make up a really small subset of the population, and it is a lifestyle choice, right? Also, do all human beings that need to eat that diet in order to be healthy? And I think from my own anecdotal experience, the answer is no, right? I have a really good friend. She has Crohn's disease. It's managed through medication and her diet. If I said to her, man, you should really be eating kale and filet mignon all the time. That's so much healthier than the food that you're choosing to eat. She would get really sick because her body has a hard time digesting leafy greens. If I look at myself, my body has a hard time digesting cruciferous vegetables. If I eat them too much, they make me sick. Broccoli and Brussels sprouts are, with quotation marks, healthy food items. But for me, they make me sick. So I can't eat those things. And if I do, I just can't eat them in like large quantities. So we have to look at each dog as an individual, just like we look at each human as an individual. Does it mean that my friend with Crohn's or myself can't live a long, healthy life? No, but we have to make choices that are going to benefit us in the long term. And also, who am I to say, if I am somebody that eats a keto diet or a carnivore diet, who am I to say with no experience, no professional experience, who am I to say to somebody that's suffering from a disease like Crohn's disease or IBS or any of these other autoimmune diseases, who am I to say to somebody that has one of these, well, the reason why you're suffering is because, you're not eating lettuce and kale and lean meat. I'm not. So to me, if I look at the flip side and I look at the human, am I only eating protein and fat in order to be the healthiest version of myself. No, because if I only ate those things, I wouldn't be the healthiest version of myself. Right? So I know for me, a balanced diet works really well. And I can say that with confidence because I've tried a million things as an adult. So we can use the same philosophy when we're looking at our dogs and looking at what, quote, works for our dogs from a dietary point of view. Okay, so kind of reorient myself here. Okay, and I just wanted to echo a little bit more of that concept in Rankovic's paper. She says, dogs do not have a dietary requirement for carbohydrate. Been talking about that for the last 10 minutes, except during pregnancy and lactation. And she has a lot of references for that specific point. So I think if anybody's interested, if you breed dogs, if you have strong opinions about it, I think it's something that you should research. However, dogs have a metabolic requirement for glucose. Similar to other species, certain tissues and cells rely on glucose for energy needs. Carbohydrate and pet food provide a valuable and important source of glucose, but if carbohydrates are provided in insufficient amounts, protein can provide animals with glucose through glucogenetic pathways. However, consuming dietary carbohydrates provides metabolic benefits by allowing the body to use the carbohydrates as an energy source so that protein can be used for other important anabolic processes like growth, tissue repair, and the immune response. What I take away from that as somebody who owns working dogs, high energy dogs, dogs where I'm training or exercising them every day almost, I look at adding carbohydrates to my dog's diet as a must. Because I have a growing female dog and I have a neutered adult male dog. And for both of those dogs, I want to make sure that the protein in their food is going towards their tissue repair. I want to make sure the fat in their food is going towards their nutrient uptake and their hormone balance. If I don't have carbohydrate in the food, the protein and the fat is going to get spread thin. And unless I'm supplementing their kibble with those items, which I oftentimes do, I'm going to have an out-of-whack dog. So to me, if I'm going to feed my dog more protein versus carbohydrate, that may work for some dogs. For other dogs, it may cause things like stomach upset. It might, pretty much like I tried to feed Ruben a raw diet and he had the worst poop in America. Because for some dogs, it's just too much protein, right? And protein is difficult for the body to digest. And as we see later on in the study, Rankovic makes the argument that it's not the carbohydrate in dog food that can cause adverse food reactions. It's the protein in dog food which causes the most food reactions. And that's a data point. It's not an opinion. So sometimes if we just want to say, well, if I just feed my dog more protein, they're going to be able to compensate for the lack of carbohydrate. Their body will be fine with the whole glucose problem. Why don't I just feed my dog more protein? You can do that if it works for your dog. I'm saying I tried to do that for my dog. It did not work for my dog. I don't know why, but it didn't. I tried every type of protein, right? I got like a bunch of different types of air-dried raw food, and I tried, and it just didn't work. So for me, I know that a mixture of kibble and a little bit of raw food here and there works out great. You do you, boo. Figure out what works for you. But just know that the adverse food reactions, the data says that the adverse food reactions might come from the protein in the food before it comes from the carbohydrate or the preservatives. And I think that it's kind of a common misconception that it's all those disgusting, crappy preservatives and carbohydrates in dog food that are causing the skin irritation on your dog or the stomach upset and yada, yada. And that very well may be the case for your dog. But again, the data is showing us that you should check out the protein source, see if that needs to be changed first. Okay, so going back to the part of the text that talks about dietary carbohydrate requirements, I talked about the importance. I talked about replacing carbohydrates with protein. I gave you my own personal anecdote for that. And this text also goes on to talk about cancer in dogs. It talks about obesity in dogs. And it talks about, again, the adverse food reactions. So I just gave a little summary And please feel free to check out these references on your own. Again, it's not a long paper. It's very easy to read. I referenced a study about the evolution of dogs, or I shouldn't say evolution, the domestication, because domestication, there's so much pressure on the dog that we can call it evolutionary, but because there was a lot of pressure on the dog, they were hanging out with us so much during that period of domestication, the evolution happened really fast. I talked about the Psychology Today article about poop. If you're interested in reading that, you of course can. And I just wanted to look at a couple other data points in closing. So if we take a look at some data points here, just quickly looking at the recent past, we see that pretty much since 1950, the dog's lifespan has increased by like almost 100%. So the domesticated dogs are living almost 100% longer than they were pre-World War II. So, and that's because of the way we feed dogs, the way we care for them in our homes, and vet care has gotten a lot better since then, right? But I think another interesting data point is that the Purina dog food company started mass producing dry dog kibble in 1956. So I'm not sitting here saying that the OG Purina dog food is the absolute best thing to feed your dog ever, but I'm just looking at that correlation. If I do a brief search on what people fed their dogs back in the day, there's a really interesting article in Northwest Naturals magazine titled A Brief History of Dog Diets That Will Shock You. And it talks about what dogs ate as, again, they were becoming domesticated. Commoners' dogs would be fed meager diets of bread crust, bare bones, potatoes, cabbage, or whatever the dog could scrounge on its own. By the 18th century, farm and hunting dogs were being fed mixed grains and lard. These useful dogs had to be healthy to do their jobs. Also talks about the Romans and over 2,000 years ago and what they were feeding their farm dogs. They were feeding their dogs barley bread soaked in milk as well as meat scraps, and they fed their war dogs more raw meat and garlic doses to strengthen them, and included vegetables, grains, and offal. So offal is lard. So we've had two references here to lard. What is lard? Well, if you butcher a pig, like my brother just butchered a couple of pigs, there is an unsightly amount of fat that comes out of those animals, like almost as much as there is meat. And we obviously use fat for cooking, but, nobody's sitting around with a bowl of lard and just digging in. So back in the day, people used the lard to feed their dogs. And they usually use that lard mixed with some sort of grain and a little bit of meat here and there, it seems. So, and, that's for, I also wanted to say here, look at this. Barley bread soaked in milk. And if I go all the way back to the text that I read in the very beginning of the podcast, this text, the textbook, it makes a huge point, that there are some starches that are pretty undigestible for dogs, and one of them is lactose. So it's very interesting to see here. And just to kind of note, we think about feeding a kitten milk, like cats really can't digest lactose. So that's kind of a funny concept. But yeah, lactose dogs don't seem to mix. Also garlic, any type of onion or garlic, like we don't feed that to dogs anymore because, they're allergic to them. But here we go. The Romans, they were feeding it to their dogs. That's the history for you. Okay. So yeah, just kind of looking back, dogs are living longer since the end of World War II, 1956. Dog kibble comes out. If we look before then, what were they feeding their dogs? Well, they're feeding their dogs a lot of grain and lard. So things that, were cheap and things that humans couldn't eat. And through all of that, we now have the dog of today. So what are some conclusions that I can draw as a pet owner from knowing this information? Well, I know that carbs are not the devil. I know that their existence in pet food, it's there because it is an inexpensive food macronutrient, and it's really easy to digest. Okay, so those two reasons are why carbs are in commercial dog foods. Dogs evolved in the domestication process to be able to digest these starchy foods. So it's okay if I feed my dog these foods, if my dog does well on the food. So I shouldn't feel guilty about it if my dog is eating carbohydrate. For me personally, I want to make sure that if I am adding calories to my dog's diet because they are working really hard, I want to add protein and fat to their diet. And we see that when we look at the ratios of sporting dog foods. So if I take a sporting dog food that's like a 26-16 blend, what does that mean? It means 26% of the food is protein, 16% is fat. The rest is fiber, usually about 3% is fiber, usually about 10% of the food is moisture, and the rest of that food is carbohydrate, which is a lot. If I look at a sport blend like 30-20 or even like a 32-32, those blends of food up the fat and protein as a way of adding calories to the dog's diet. I know that for me, it's more important for me to give my clients advice regarding their dog's weight. So I want to look at that body mass scale and make sure that my clients are not overfeeding their dogs, because I know that that's the best advice I can give my client regarding the longevity of their dog. I do believe that some dog foods are going to be too calorie dense for a dog. Thus, your dog will have a hard time being at an appropriate weight on some dog food. I already gave the example of my little dog, Reuben. He was eating the same kind of 30-20 blend of dog food that Buddha eats. He was gaining weight. I had to cut down his food too much to the point where, I look at the food and say, hey, he's not getting enough of those micronutrients and vitamins and minerals. I need to feed him more food. So I switched him to a different blend of food that was a little less calorie dense. So I personally think that it's important for people to make decisions based on their dog's biofeedback, what their dog is telling them. And lastly, don't be surprised that as your dog ages, their food tolerances will change. So if I look at a dog food like a hydrolyzed dog food, for example, that dog food is very, very easy for the dog to digest because they artificially break down the food so that it's easy to digest the macronutrients in that food. If somebody comes to me and their 12-year-old dog is on hydrolyzed dog food, I am not going to say this food is trash, like you need to start feeding raw food, or, that again, going back to my Crohn's disease example, that'd be like me saying to a friend, hey, you should be eating this when she's sick. So as dogs age, things start to slow down. It's like an unfortunate fact of life. Like it would be just great if all of our dogs would live to 13 and just kind of like lie down in the corner and that's the end of the story. They don't do that to us. They get sick. They get cancer. They get heart disease. They get diabetes. And you may sit there and say, yes, they get cancer and diabetes because of the food they eat. They get cancer and diabetes because they get old, and that's what happens. And our immune system starts to break down. Is diet a part of that? Like, yes, absolutely it is. Is it the only part? No, it's part of the aging process. It's going to happen to all of us as well. So make informed decisions, do some research, read these articles if you're interested. Again, I'm not an authority. So just as a disclaimer, I never want anybody to listen to this podcast and be like, Leah said, blah, blah, blah. Just like I never want anybody to quote a blog post and be like, hey, this blog post said blah, blah, blah. I don't refer to any blog posts in these type of episodes because they're not articles. They're not researched and verified, right? So it's my job to just be like, hey, here's this information. Do with it what you will. And I think that it's great that I can present it in this form if you find it to be valuable. Otherwise, you as a smart person should do your own research and come to your own conclusions based on what works for you and your dog. So I hope you've been enjoying these little mini episodes. I pray to God Laurie's going to be back with me next time because these are very, very difficult for me to record. And yeah, she's been chasing titles and accomplishing a lot. So yeah, hope you enjoyed. See you next time.